afternoon, Sergeants. My name is Sergeant Sirard, and welcome to today's brief. The risk assessment for today is low. The classification is unclassified. And in case of any emergencies, we have exits to your left and to your right. And let's get on to the brief. So today's brief is going to be interpersonal communications. The agenda for today is we're going to be talking about what interpersonal communication means. We're also going to talk about the characteristics and how it solves problems and the impacts it has on the unit itself or organization itself. And then we're going to come with a collision, and then if you have any questions, you can ask it at the end of this brief. We'll have a point for that too. So interpersonal communication, that's done personally, normally face to face, where you communicate to your person, to your front, to your left, to your right, and there's other ways to communicate. It's typically done verbally, but there's also non-verbally, and then there's also active listening. Those are also some we'll talk about later in this brief. So the characteristics, as we were talking about earlier, are verbal. Verbal is where you communicate verbally. Is talking to your person in front of you, to the side, and y'all just verbally talk. And we can usually just talk about anything, about your day, how you've been in your daily lives, and what's going on with how you feel about things. Nonverbal communication is typically done through expressions, how you walk around, how you act towards others, and just simply like me waving my hands to my neighbors or anything like that, just letting them know that I'm here and I'm ready to communicate with you. And some people use sign language, and that's usually one way to communicate is through good sign language. Active listening is actively just listening to your person around you, just engaging them without verbally or just presenting yourself by any ways. And when they ask you a question, you can usually just respond with a nod or a yes, but you're actively engaging by listening to what they have to say, not being the person who talks the whole time. And those are basically the characteristics of interpersonal communications. Now, how to solve problems. A lot of times you go into work, you'll get into conflicts with your person in the office, y'all have disagreements, y'all just don't know how to resolve it. Well, just communicate. Sit there and try to figure out a way you can answer that problem out or figure that problem out. A lot of times you can also there's goals. You can sit there and talk about things that you want to do, things that you have in your mind you want to achieve. And a lot of times that's a way you can actually open up about what kind of person you really are and to your leaders and this and that. And even leaders have goals. Everybody has goals. And you can build some type of trust around each other by just talking about it, where you can have the person to your right, he wants to tell you something, listen, be that active listener. And then you can also, there's also being a good leader to your subordinates. The best way to be a good leader to your subordinates is talk to them daily. Engage in their and active listening with them and talking about, hey, what you got going on this weekend. You can simply just talk about things like that. If you are having any issues, hey, I'm always here for you. Those are actively, verbally communicating with your subordinates and people around you, letting them know, hey, I'm here for you. I want to be a great leader. And that's one way of being a good leadership towards your subordinates. Alright, so the impacts. Alright, so a lot of people would say relationships are like your spouse or how you got a relationship with your family and stuff like that. That's relationships, right? Well, not all relationships always deals with who you're married to or who your spouse is or who your boyfriend, girlfriend is. And they can also be how you build a relationship with the people around you. Your co-workers, your subordinates, your leaderships. You can build relationships in many ways. And by communicating is a great way to be able to have a great alliance with them. And leadership. You can't lead if you ain't communicating. A lot of leaders, the best way to be a great leader is to understand who's your subordinates, the things going on in their daily lives. And the best way to figure that out is you got to communicate. You got to be the active listener. You don't always have to talk. You can always use your nonverbal communication by just nodding, agreeing, and stuff like that. And then teamwork is our team. So to be a great team, a good team, you got to learn how to work as a team. You got to learn how to communicate as a team. And you got to learn to be the active listener. You got to take in some information really quickly. And sometimes you just got to learn how you can trust each other, rely on each other. Learn how to be able to communicate with one another without arguing, without fighting, and stuff like that. And that's a good way to be able to use interpersonal communications towards one another. Alright, so the conclusion and what we have came up, we talked about interpersonal communications. We talked about how to define it. Basically, we talked about how you communicate with one another. We also talked about characteristics of interpersonal communications. We talked about how the characteristics are nonverbal, and we talked about how they're verbal, and we talked about how they're active listeners, right? And we also talked about how to resolve problems within organizations and being able to communicate. And it's not just communicate, but build goals and be able to understand that we gotta lead and not just direct. And the types of impacts that we have in organizations, we talked about that. We talked about how they could, the impacts don't just affect just your coworkers. It impacts your relationships, it can impact your team, and it can also impact how you lead soldiers. And so now we'll go into the next slide. And anybody have any questions?
How could we apply this to our daily lives?
You could apply interpersonal communication through just simply talking to your spouse about how your day's been. You could also go and have a sit down with your family, your mom and dad, or be able to sit down and tell them, hey, I have goals, I have things I want to do in my life. And you can also engage and just listen if they have anything going on in their lives. It ain't just have to deal with it your workplace, but you can also take it home to your family and your everyday lives. And maybe take the time to listen and understand how you can verbally communicate with not so much verbal, just use nonverbal. There's other ways of communicating. Any other questions?
How could you use interpersonal communication at work?
How could you use it, interpersonal communication at work? You could try to take that time and when someone is talking to you to listen, actively listen, and try to respond with a normal verbal communication, or you could use non-verbal communication, but just take the moment to sit back and rather than lash out or say anything crazy, just simply just listen. Be an active listener, because that's a really big term in all of this, is being able to actively listen to people and using that as our way of communication. Is there any other questions? No. Alright, so that will conclude today's brief. If you have any other concerns or any other questions, you can see me after this.